The crowd pressed forward, their breath clouding in the London air. Shackled, bruised, and dragged behind horses, William Wallace's eyes didn't beg for mercy. They burned with defiance. What awaited him wasn't death alone, but a spectacle of cruelty designed to erase hope from all who dared resist. The year was 1305, and England's capital was swollen with noise and fear. Vendors shouted from stalls, bells rang in distant churches, and yet, beneath it all, a darker anticipation brewed. The Scottish knight William Wallace had been captured, betrayed by men who once called him brother. Shackled and bound, he was paraded through narrow streets, dragged behind a wooden frame so the cobblestones scraped flesh from his back. To the English, this was justice. To the Scottish, King Edward I was a man of iron. He had crushed Wales, expelled entire populations, and ruled with a cold hand that never trembled. To him, Wallace wasn't a soldier. He was an insult. And insults demanded theater, not just punishment. For years, Edward's spies hunted the rebel across forests and glens. Wallace became a shadow, slipping between towns, appearing in whispers, surviving on the loyalty of peasants who risked everything to feed him bread or hide him in their barns. But betrayal often blooms closest to home. In August 1305, a Scottish knight named Sir John de Menteith, once sworn to Scotland's cause, sold him to the English. The capture wasn't grand. No clash of swords, no last stand. Just chains, ropes, and the final snap of trust breaking. London celebrated his capture, but Edward's true work had only begun. The king planned not to kill Wallace quickly, but to tear him apart so slowly that Scotland itself would bleed with him. Dragged south from Scotland, Wallace's journey became part of his sentence. Every village he passed through was another stage, another chance to display the broken rebel. Bound to a horse, chained so tightly his wrists swelled, he was treated not as a man but as a warning. Crowds gathered along roadsides, eager to see the infamous knight. Mothers pointed at him as if to scare children into obedience. Soldiers spat and jeered. Some even struck him as he passed, emboldened by his helplessness. Yet Wallace never lowered his head. Witnesses later swore his gaze cut through chains, fixed not on the mob but on some distant horizon. That defiance unnerved even his guards. They wanted him broken, begging, groveling. But silence was his rebellion. By the time he reached the Tower of London, weeks of humiliation had failed to strip his dignity, and that alone made Edward furious. To the king, it meant Wallace had to be destroyed in a way no legend could survive. The trial was a performance staged in Westminster Hall on August 23, 1305. Latin words echoed off stone walls. Charges of treason, murder, sacrilege. Wallace didn't understand the tongue, but he understood the intent. He was never meant to walk free. When given his chance to speak, he answered with fire, "I never swore loyalty to Edward. How could I betray a king who was never mine?" Gasps rippled through the hall. The judges, handpicked by Edward, sneered. They needed no deliberation. The sentence had been written before Wallace even entered. He would be dragged through London, hanged until near death, gutted while still alive, beheaded, then quartered. Each act was symbolic. His body dismantled as his cause had been. The verdict wasn't about justice. It was about fear. Edward wanted every Scot to hear Wallace's scream in their dreams. But in that chamber, Wallace gave them no scream, only a glare that turned his enemies into witnesses of their own cruelty. Dawn crept over London like a blade. In the yard below the tower, carpenters tightened ropes, checked the hurdle, and stoked a brazier that breathed orange light. Wallace listened to the small sounds, a guard's cough, the creak of wheels, the rustle of straw. Fear lived in his chest, but he would not feed it. a young jailer named Thomas slipped into the cell with a cup of water. "For your throat," he said, voice shaking. His mother was from Ayrshire, he whispered, and she had told him stories of fields that smelled of rain. "I can't free you," Thomas added, "but I can carry a message." Wallace nodded to a strip of leather he had hidden, scored with a prayer and a name. "For Elspeth of Kilglen." Thomas tucked it under his sleeve. Outside, the cart rattled. Chains kissed stone. Wallace stood, every bruise a bell tolling. He would step into the day as a man, not a warning. The door opened. The world waited. They tied him to the hurdle, a rough wooden frame, and the horses leaned into their straps. The procession set off from the tower toward Smithfield, weaving through streets already crowded. Vendors pushed past to hawk pies. Children climbed barrels for a better view. Soldiers cleared a path with pikes. As the cart jolted, pain clawed his back, yet he raised his head. On a balcony, an old woman crossed herself. A boy dropped his apple and ran. In the press, Wallace saw a flash of rough wool. Thomas again, moving with purpose, hand to his sleeve where the leather prayer rested. Past St. Paul's, bells rang like iron hearts. At every turning, a herald recited his crimes in a ringing voice, but the words thinned against the wind. Wallace breathed in tar, smoke, and river salt. He fixed his gaze on the open sky, that thin band of blue no crown could touch. When jeers rose, he borrowed silence and let it carry him forward. Smithfield spread before him like a stage. The scaffold was high, the rope knotted with cruel care. A brazier burned at the platform's edge, its heat licking the morning. The executioner, masked in coarse linen, tested the knot, then nodded to the sheriff. Close by, a clerk unrolled parchment, ready to memorialize every step. In the front ranks of onlookers stood Sir John de Menteith, hands folded, eyes flat as pewter. Wallace studied him without hatred. Betrayal had already done its work. Contempt would only spend what strength remained. A priest approached with a crucifix. "Do you repent?" he asked softly. Wallace answered not with theology, but truth. "I repent the harm I could not prevent." The priest's eyes filled. He pressed a simple blessing onto Wallace's brow and stepped back. Above them, gulls turned white circles, indifferent judges. The sheriff lifted his hand. The crowd surged, a living tide. Wallace flexed his fingers once, the small ritual of a soldier finding his grip. They raised him to the noose and tightened it until the world narrowed. Feet kicked, vision blurred, and sounds folded into distant thunder. Before darkness closed, the sheriff signaled, and the rope slackened. Wallace fell, gasping, the scaffold planks cold against his cheek. The crowd's roar swelled, hunger fed, but something shifted at the edge. A woman in a plain gray cloak, Elspeth, forced forward, shielded by Thomas. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She held his gaze the way a door holds a house. In her eyes, he saw green coastline and laughter he thought he had left behind. The executioner hesitated, a beat no one else noticed. Thomas slipped a small pouch to the priest, the leather prayer, and the priest tucked it into his sleeve with a nod. It was a tiny rebellion, a seed planted in hard ground. The sheriff snapped, and the brutal script resumed. Yet the rope's second rise met a man anchored by memory, held to earth by love that defied spectacle. The scaffold became theater, and cruelty its script. Wallace was stretched across a bench, wrists and ankles bound with leather straps. The executioner's blade flashed in the sunlight, sharp enough to slice air. The crowd leaned forward, hungry for pain, but the silence that followed was heavier than their anticipation. Wallace clenched his jaw until blood welled in his mouth, refusing to give them the cry they craved. The brazier hissed, iron blackened with heat. Each cut, each motion, was designed to remind Scotland that defiance meant degradation. Yet something unexpected spread through the crowd. A few faces paled, some turned away, unable to reconcile the hero they had heard of with the horror in front of them. Even cruelty, when witnessed too closely, begins to curdle. The sheriff barked orders to keep the spectacle alive, but a fissure had opened. Wallace had become less a man and more a mirror, showing everyone what power looks like when stripped of all disguise.